Hey, this is Andrew, and I'm here to talk to you about 5 ways that Keyforge is different from Magic the Gathering. And I decided to make a quick video about this because there have been a few more posts lately in the Keyforge Facebook group asking about different mechanics and elements of Keyforge and why they're this way and not that way. And I thought, hey, for a lot of Magic players that are coming over, since a new set just got released, wouldn't it be cool to have a little bit of explanation? And I wanted to do 2 things before I actually get into it. And one of them is talk about my own experience with Magic and why I have anything to say about this. And then the other thing is to talk about the what I think are sort of 3 broad types of players coming over from Magic to Keyforge. So my own experience, I haven't played Magic a ton. Certainly haven't played it competitively, but I was playing Draft for a while with other people at my work. Um, they had a really cool program where the company was trying to encourage people hanging out, and so they would actually pay the cost for everybody to do drafts. There were some other clubs that benefited from stuff like that too. So I got to do that for free. That was a really cool, fun experience, and I had a good time. At the time, I was also getting into Android Netrunner, and ultimately decided, well, due to time constraints, I could only do one or the other, and I was enjoying Netrunner a lot more. It cost me something, and uh, I couldn't turn around and sell the cards, but it was just a more fun experience, and so it was what I wanted to do. And so that just gives you a little perspective, and I guess out to me, I guess, as somebody who doesn't love Magic, um, but I don't begrudge people who do love it. So I just want to get that out of the way. I'm not here to bash Magic or to bash people who like Magic. I realized it just wasn't my favorite thing out of the various options that I had available to me. Um, yeah, and I love Netrunner. Haven't played in a while, but just really, really loved Netrunner, and am really enjoying Keyforge. Now, there are 3 broad categories, I think, of players who are, you know, coming from Magic over to the Keyforge community. And the first are people who have a disposition kind of like mine. They're just really excited to get into Keyforge. They might still be really excited about Magic, but they're also really excited about Keyforge, or maybe they're disillusioned with Magic and they're coming over uh, and just really excited. Um, the second group is people who are they're interested, but maybe they're a little more skeptical. They're trying to ask hard questions about why is this something I would want to be involved with. They're curious. Sometimes they're confused by the way certain things work, and that is fine too. If you're one of those people, I'm really glad you're here, and you're the main group that I am hoping this video is helpful to. The third group of people, there are some people who I've seen just come over to be trolls, and um, I actually think they're a relatively small group, but you notice it because it's frustrating. And the first game back before Keyforge was released, the first game that I got on the Crucible to play, I had an opponent who, like, on turn 1, I dropped a big creature, which, if you played Keyforge, having a big creature on the board doesn't mean much. And this guy goes, "Oh, you got a bigger creature than me, I lose," and then just proceeded to be really, really negative. And I just thought, why are you here? If you aren't interested in this, if you don't like this, then you don't have to do it. Don't come over and yell at me. Um, so if you're that kind of person, I would just say, if you don't enjoy Keyforge, then do something you enjoy. Um, if you are interested in Keyforge, just it's okay to ask critical questions or say things that you wish worked differently, but do it in a way that isn't mean and gross to other people. So anyway, okay, with that out of the way, let's get into this. What are some ways that Keyforge is different from Magic the Gathering? I'm going to start with some obvious ones, which are around the win conditions. Keyforge is a race, it's not a fight. In Magic, the whole point of the game is to try to make the other player lose HP so that so you win. I mean, when they hit 0 HP, you win. So in Keyforge, quite different. You're trying to forge 3 keys. You get Amber to make keys. Very different win conditions. And it's been interesting to me how few people have a problem with this, because this is, I mean, it makes it such a different game than Magic, but a lot of people coming over from Magic, that this isn't what gets them or confuses them, that they're fine with this. So anyway, that's just been an interesting observation, that people seem to not mind this at all. Second difference, still on win conditions here. In Magic, you could deck your opponent and win that way. There's nothing like that in Keyforge. When you run out of cards and you need to draw, you just flip your deck over, shuffle it, and keep going. And so that's significantly different. And I remember just deck management in general is super different in Keyforge. I remember back when I switched to Netrunner, a lot of players coming over from Magic to Netrunner would see a card like Diesel. If you're familiar with Netrunner, it had 0 cost, and you play it and you draw 3 cards. I guess the cost is it costs a click, but you would draw 3 cards, and people coming over from Magic would say, "Oh my gosh, this is an amazing card. This, like, every deck must include this, right?" And no, it's just okay, because the draw dynamics were very different. And similar here, the draw dynamics in Keyforge are so different. You kind of want to burn through your deck, and then you get to turn it over and keep going. It's not quite true. There are no alternate win conditions. There are some cards in Keyforge that let you forge a key outside of the normal step 1 of your turn, and so those give some sort of alternate win condition. Some of them are Amber based, but there are others like Redacted or the Epic Quest that are about Might Makes Right that are about having a certain board state and set of turn sequences. So those do provide a little bit of an alternate win condition, but they only provide each a third of your win condition, and you're still forging a key. So it's not like just you're playing a totally different game. Yeah, and those cards are not ubiquitous, and even in the most recent Vault Tour, it was a sealed event, but I don't think either of the decks that were in the top 2 there had key cheating cards. So they're definitely not required to do well. The third one, and this is where I've seen people not necessarily get upset, but maybe start to pine for the old way, is that in Keyforge you get a generated deck, you buy the deck, you open it, you play with it, you don't get to build a deck. And so you'll see a lot of posts come up or discussions come up where people are saying, oh, well, what if we have some sort of format where we deck build? And that it comes in the form of use any card you want, you pick a third of a deck from one deck with a house you want, and then a third of a house from a different deck, and so you're still kind of constrained, but I think people call that alliance or something like that, or let's have a draft cube, and those are all interesting ideas. They're not how Keyforge was designed. Anyway, if you enjoy playing that way, I think that's totally reasonable, and I hope you have a ton of fun. I don't think it's reasonable to expect FFG to support that officially or change anything about it, because they're excited about exploring this idea of a unique deck game. So let them really focus on that, and if you want to develop this stuff on the side, then have at it. And I think Brad Andrews said as much in a GDC talk that he gave. Someone asked him about deck building, and his response was, you know, if you're having fun that way, then more power to you. But it's not something that we're interested in exploring or supporting. So there you go. And yeah, and I have to say, to me, it's not super interesting. I really enjoy deck building, and I still, like I said, I'm a huge fan of Netrunner. I play the Arkham Horror LCG, uh, and I've definitely played other deck building games before. I like that feel, but I'm very okay with not getting that out of Keyforge. And in fact, I really enjoy the aspect of just being able to pick up a deck and play with it. It lets me focus on a different thing, and I really like when games say, "But what if we didn't have this?" Or, you know, "What if we limit it to this?" It's a fun thing for me, so it doesn't bother me. Again, if you want to have fun, however you want to have fun, then more power to you. And one aspect I think that I really appreciate about the generated deck is the sort of do the most with what you have feel. And if you've played games like video games like Faster Than Light or other procedural games, there is an element there too of like you can't totally plot your course. You don't know what you're going to get, and you're going to have to try to milk whatever situation you end up in, but then move on. And I find that a really enjoyable experience, and I like getting that out of Keyforge. And I definitely feel like people focus a lot on deck power, and there are definitely decks that are stronger than others, but the power level that you as a player can achieve with a deck after having played 10 or 20 games with it is going to be it's going to be substantially different than the way you were playing it the first time, because you've figured out how it works, you've figured out how it responds in different situations, and I think people don't give enough credence to that aspect of the game, and they feel like, oh, if this deck didn't do well, it must just not be good. But I've had decks that struggled, and then I figured them out, and they turned out to be fantastic. So really don't give short shrift to that idea that you can improve as a player and deck combination. Okay, and then this is where people start to, like, I think, get into this and the next one are in a category where I think people are trying to solve a problem that maybe the game doesn't have as much. So in Magic, in constructed formats, you can have a sideboard, which is a set of cards. Maybe you have a deck of 60 cards on a sideboard of 15, and when you are in a matchup, after you're going to play like best of 3, well, after your first game, you can take cards from your sideboard and switch them out for your other cards. So you still have a 60 card deck, but you've changed out some of them based on what your opponent's doing. And it's a way to keep the meta lively, because people have options. They don't have to lock into a certain thing. They can swap things in and out. And FFG has had a philosophy around this for a while that I think, first of all, strives to not have silver bullets, cards that are only good in certain situations. So it's not that they don't ever make those, but they've tried to avoid situations where it's like, well, if they have this deck and you don't have this one card, you're toast. But if you do have it, then you're going to win. That's not a good meta experience. And if you have that, then sideboarding is a way to ameliorate it a little bit, to lessen the effect of it. But what if you just didn't have that problem, And in Keyforge, you have that problem less because people can't build decks, right? So now people can still go on eBay and find whatever deck archetype they want and buy that, but you still get, like, I'm amazed sometimes people bring really good decks, but then they have like a weird card. I have a deck that I opened in AOA that is fantastic. It's one of, last time I checked, only 3 decks in AOA that have 8 or more chains so far. And it's fantastic. It's really good. It also has 4 alpha cards in Shadows, which is stupid. It doesn't matter because it does well even with that, but it has that. It could be better if it didn't have that. So I think you'll get, oh wow, there's these really powerful decks, but they have a couple of weird things that you're like, I would never put that in there, and I think that's great. And once in a while, you'll end up in a situation where you have a deck like that, and you end up having a chance where it makes sense to play one of those cards, and it helps you, and you're like, oh wow, that was cool that I had that in there. So I think the unique deck part helps a little bit with that. In organized play, there are some formats that help with this. Survival is one where you bring multiple decks and you play until one is defeated. Well, that means that if you're worried about a particular archetype, you can bring one deck that is good against that. You don't have to bring all decks that are good against that archetype. Triad is another example of this, where you bring 3 decks, but when you match up with your opponent, you pick one of their decks that they won't get to play. Adaptive is really good for this because you're going to actually switch decks, and then you have a chance to bid chains. So if one deck is particularly good against the other, you can balance it that way, right? It'll probably win both the first 2 games, and you can bid chains to balance that. And auction is a really fun way of doing this, where it gives you a chance to try to figure out the relative strength of decks within the pool of decks that are there, and bid chains on them, and so theoretically speaking, the decks that are going to be stronger in that meta are going to end up with more chains, and everything ends up fairly even. Brad Andrews also talked about in that same GDC talk this idea that the amount of draw that you get in Keyforge is a sort of dynamic sideboard, because you can, if a card isn't helpful, you can just discard it, and that frees you up to draw another card, so it doesn't feel as bad to discard it. And I think Archive also provides a sort of dynamic sideboard where you're like, this card isn't particularly useful now, but it could be useful later depending on how the game progresses. So I'm going to stash it in my archives until it makes sense to play it. So in that way, I think what they've achieved is having a sort of sideboard system that is built into the structure of the game and is also built into the organized play structure without actually changing cards out. The number 5 here is response opportunities, and this is another one where I think that people are looking for a solution that feels familiar, but it's for a problem that isn't necessarily present in the game. So in Magic, there are 2 main response mechanisms that I can think of that happen during your opponent's turn, and one of them is declaring blockers. So when your opponent is on their turn, they declare attackers. They decide which of their creatures are going to attack you. Then you get a chance to declare blockers. You decide, this creature is going to block that creature that's attacking, etc. And so you're responding on their turn. The other example is instant speed, where maybe they declare attackers, and then you use an instant speed spell to kill one of their creatures, to do damage to one of their creatures before that attack can hit, and then maybe they respond by playing an instant speed spell that cancels yours or something like that. There's a lot of back and forth that happens that way, and it's limited by the cards that you have in your hand, as well as what mana you have in your pool, what mana you have available to you. In Keyforge, however, so sometimes people ask, well, why doesn't Keyforge have some sort of mechanism where you can play a card in response at a sort of instant speed? and maybe cancel a card your opponent played or something like that. And the first reason I would say is that, well, I think this is really the reason that that's not needed in Keyforge, is that the ability to respond is actually just baked into the flow of the game even without that. So, for example, the win condition is you forge keys, right? Well, in Keyforge, you forge keys at the start of your turn. So that means that on your turn you might generate a lot of amber, but then your opponent has their whole turn to respond. Now, again, there are some cards that let you forge in the middle, like Key Charge, for example, but those shouldn't be deciding the whole outcome of the game, right? Maybe you get to use that once or at best twice during a game, but you're not totally deciding the game that way. So your opponent has a whole turn, typically, to respond and try to do something with your amber. And again, go watch the Birmingham Vault Tour finals. There's a really cool ending to the game where there's swings back and forth with the amber, and the players are keeping each other from forging for a little while until finally one of them does. But there's a lot of back and forth in amber control just built into the game, and because you don't forge until the start of your turn, your opponent has a lot of opportunities to respond. Even with creatures come out exhausted. If they ready at the end of your turn, that means that your opponent has a whole turn where they can do things about it. And Keyforge has cards that steal quite a bit of amber. Keyforge has cards that just do a complete board wipe and destroy every creature on the board. Keyforge has cards that put every artifact that's on the board off the board, or even just destroy them all. So there's a lot of opportunities in Keyforge to respond. It's just that the response happens on the opponent's turn, not in the middle of the current player's turn. So because of that, I just think that the instants aren't necessary. There might be a few cases, and the double library access phase shift key charge thing was an example of this, where it would have been nice to have an opportunity to interrupt and cancel, but FFG chose to errata library access to solve that problem. And so I think as long as they're trying not to make more of those situations and then responding when they come up, I think this is a pretty good situation. I actually think this is more interesting ultimately, because the back and forth is not limited by mana cost or how many cards you have in your hand, because you can play a turn where you respond, you swing things back, and then at the end of that turn you're going to draw back up to 6. So there can be these like longer volleys that I think are pretty cool. Yeah, and so because of all that, I just don't think that there's a need for instant spells. Now, some people have brought up the idea that, oh, well, this is just because they want it to play well online. And I do think it will play better online because of this, but I don't believe that was like their only reason. And actually, if you look at the history of FFG's games, they really started exploring this sort of back and forth with Star Wars Destiny, where the play just goes back and forth very quickly, and so I think they've just been pushing for this model where it's not this interrupt driven turn. It's just in the flow. Okay, and then I have a bonus here, and that is I wanted to talk about the aftermarket, and I guess this is actually an area where they're not that different. A lot of people have, complained about Magic that it is pay to win. Sometimes there are better cards that you can get, and those will just let you cruise to a victory. I think that's true if you certainly at low levels of play. If you get better cards, you have a better chance of winning. If you probably at even maybe at medium levels of play, at the highest levels of play, I don't know that that's really true. There might sometimes be cards that you really need, but I think a lot of it does come down to how things are played, and same in Keyforge. I've seen. I have a guy in my local meta who's a good player. He has a deck that I think could probably, before the library access errata, have sold for hundreds of dollars online, if not over 1,000. I wouldn't be shocked if someone would have been willing to pay that much for it. It was that good. And I have a deck that went 2-0 against it. That's pretty good, but it's not my best deck. My best deck is probably more likely to lose against this thing, but I have a deck that is pretty good and is 2-0 against it just because it's able to go faster. And so I think, again, some of this goes back to the deck building, the no deck building aspect of it, where you can't really get a perfect deck. And some of it also just goes to the fact that how things draw and how you play can really make a huge difference. And my assessment of how much skill plays into Keyforge has gone up over time. I think as I've realized, as I've seen my own mistakes and then been able to correct them over time and clean up my play a little bit, I've realized that there's a lot of room for good play decisions, even good calls about guessing what's in your opponent's hand or deck really play into the game. So there is a major aftermarket for Keyforge decks, and sometimes I wince at the amounts that people pay, but it's the invisible hand doing its thing. I think it's fine, and if people are getting enjoyment out of the way they're spending that money, then it's hard to be mad at them. And if people are getting enjoyment out of selling the deck, it's hard to be mad at them. And on the other hand, I just don't believe that that market is driving a situation where some people just only win because of that. I don't think that's really as common as people think. So, or some people think. So anyway, that's my thoughts on that. And I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you found something informative in it. Maybe it helped you think through, especially these issues of sideboarding and response a little differently in a fresh way. It's not to me about Keyforge being better than Magic, although I definitely enjoy it more, but it's about just it's different, and they're trying something new. And I think if you try to experience it as this new thing instead of trying to shoehorn it into your past experiences, you'll be better off. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more videos like this, then please do subscribe or follow me. And if you know of somebody who you think might learn something from this video, then share it with them. Thanks, and keep on forging.